When Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine, one strange detail stood out to me, and that's namely the appearance of the letter Z, right? It was originally painted across tanks and trucks. The Z was later on used by the Russians in its propaganda efforts, and it became a symbol of national identity within Russia. In my previous video, I was talking about Russia's younger brother complex, which in my opinion is currently taking place, and that's sort of the reasoning as to why this war is actually happening. One thing that stood out to me was the Z symbol, and fundamentally, the Z is not present within the Russian alphabet. So in my previous video, I mentioned that it's simply a projection. Russia is trying to use its enemy, the West, to define itself. It's projecting onto the West. It's basically taking something from the Western culture, right? And assimilating it and making it its own. That fundamentally shows the idea that Russia is envious of the West because it is using the West to define itself, because it is suffering from an identity crisis. When a person or a nation lacks a clear sense of self, they may borrow these elements from others to construct a false identity. The Z became a mask, an attempt to create a unity, right, through otherness. It is a symbol of crisis. It's not just a military, but existential symbol in the psychological sense. To define itself, Russia tried to reach outwards, but Ukraine reached inward, which is visible in its Tryzub symbol, as the Ukrainians call it. So the Ukrainian Tryzub, the Trident, it's a symbol of legacy in the Ukrainian culture. It ties itself to Russian history as well. It originates from the Kievan Rus, specifically the Rurik dynasty. The angle from which I'm trying to approach this symbol is more psychological. It's not necessarily historical. Also, I would add that there are a lot of disputes among historians if it comes to the Rurik dynasty, with which Putin is obsessed. From what I understand, the entire story about the Rurik dynasty has lots of uncertainties surrounding it. It is historically proven that Scandinavians were present in the eastern parts of Europe. They were active in Eastern Europe at the time, and these Nordic tribes intermingled with the Slavic tribes, which without a doubt affected early state formation in the region. But the historical accuracy of the entire story is not the subject of this video. Okay, I want to make that clear. Because if we were to approach this from a Jungian point of view, we would discover that there is a lot of truth in myths, but at the same time, there's a lot of myth in truth. What I'm interested personally is discovering the symbol itself through the Jungian lens, meaning taking a look at the Ukrainian unconscious, collective unconscious, which shaped this symbol, although this symbol dates back into history. So from what I found is that it appears to be often interpreted as a falcon diving, potentially symbolizing power and nobility. It can also symbolize Trinity, and that's actually my first observation because this is related to the Orthodox Church. The Orthodox Church is fundamentally bound to the idea of the Holy Trinity, the God, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So the Ukrainian Tryzub can represent that. This also indicates that although at times Russia is using its Orthodox religion as a reasoning behind this war, right? They also claim that this is a religious war. Ukraine is actually the one who is using this symbolism, not Russia. So that itself kind of shows you the hidden motives in this war, the underlying reality which actually shapes this conflict. From this perspective, if we take a look at the symbolism, it actually betrays the secrets of the psyche of the nation and therefore its ultimate intentions. Next up, the third interpretation would be that the Ukrainian Tryzub symbolizes an anchor, right? Since during the Rurik dynasty, the Scandinavians intermingled with the Slavic tribes. It also could tie itself to the maritime background of the Vikings, right? If you take a look at an anchor, it's essentially a heavy object. Symbolically, it can be heavy from a psychological standpoint, which means that it could essentially stand for deep rootedness, right? Fundamentally, stability and connection to the sea. The sea, from a Jungian point of view, the sea represents the unconscious. This is a fun fact, but I actually discovered that young girls often tend to have dreams about the sea, right? So it's actually interesting how the sea is tied to the female, to the anima aspect. I personally know a case of a young girl, very young girl, who told me about a dream that she dreamt of being a mermaid, and she was swimming in the sea. And I did not tell the child, of course, what I think of the dream. So she told me this dream, and I thought to myself, that's very interesting, because the mermaid, from a mythical point of view, is a feminine symbol, right? Ultimately, the symbol of the anima. And since the little girl that told me about this dream was dreaming of swimming in the sea, in the ocean, it could sort of symbolize that her femininity, her womanhood, is still in the unconscious, right? It's not surfaced into the consciousness. But that was just a tangent. Anyway, that was just something that I found very interesting, and I thought that it might be worth sharing. Anyway, next up, I wanted to talk about the fourth interpretation that came to my mind. That was viewing the Ukrainian Tryzub from the point of view of Greek mythology, tying it to Poseidon, the god of the sea, commands the sea. And Poseidon uses the trident to command the sea. And since the sea represents the unconscious, it means that the Ukrainian nation, the Ukrainian collective unconscious, has a command over its unconscious, right? So this symbol is tied with a very powerful and strong sense of resilience and deep sort of religious, in a way, mythical power. Ultimately, you can also approach this if we were to take a look into, since we're in ancient Greece, if we were to take a look into ancient Rome, the gladiators were using the trident often in the Colosseum, right? It was used as a weapon in the Colosseum. And the gladiators would basically have to fight enemies. And after they beat a certain amount of opponents and they come out alive, there was this promise of providing them with freedom, right? They would no longer have to be a slave. So you can spot this in this war that Ukraine is fighting for its independence. Therefore, it's using the trident as a gladiator to fight oppression, right? So the final thing that's worthy noting, and Ukrainians are even aware of this consciously, is that there is a word Ukrainians often use, and that's actually hidden within the symbol, and that is the word volya, which means freedom, but at the same time, it can mean will, right? Will to do something, will to fight, which can be seen within the trident as such. And many Russians might point out that it's also present in the Russian language, right? In Imperial Russia under Tsars, the word volya had a dual meaning. It could refer to freedom, but it was more tied to the Tsar's authority. The Tsar was the emperor, and he was seen as the ultimate authority within the Russian psyche. He was sort of the one who could give and who could take away freedom. So in this context, volya in the Russian sense can tie itself to the obedience and to the will of the Tsar, because the Tsar is ultimately the authority and the ruler, and it ties itself into it in a way that if you look at the Russian feudal society, especially during the time of serfdom, the peasants were bound to their landowners in Russia. In the Russian sense, means that the concept of volya was also associated with the freedom granted by the Tsar. So it wasn't necessarily the freedom in the modern sense, it was more of a freedom that was achieved by the Tsar granting the person freedom. So the freedom was not attained by fighting, it was attained by serving the Tsar. Is my point that I'm trying to make. So it involved obedience to social structures within Russia where personal freedom was granted or restricted by authority. It was not fought for. In the Ukrainian sense, however, Volya carries a much more romantic, a much more nationalistic and spiritual resonance. In Ukraine, it is deeply tied to the idea of freedom from foreign domination, particularly during the periods of Cossack uprisings, especially the Soviet Union, right? The Soviet oppression and the struggle for independence within the Soviet Union by Ukraine. It embodies the idea of self-determination and liberation. So if you were to try to analyze this from a linguistic point of view, now I'm not a Russian native, I'm not a Ukrainian native, but if I were to show an example of a use of this particular word within the Russian and the Ukrainian context, there is a fundamental difference because in Russian you could say "Он всегда проявлял волю к победе." This would mean that he always showed willpower for victory. In this sentence, Volya emphasizes the willpower or personal determination, showcasing an individual's internal strength to overcome challenges. So that ties itself back into the Russian psyche, right? That they went through a lot of suffering. They had to deal with a lot of wars, a lot of famine. So if I were to give you an example from the Ukrainian point of view of how that word is most likely perceived, it would be in Ukrainian, you could say Ukraina це воля, which in translation means Ukraine is freedom. But if you were to try to say the same thing in Russian, you'd say Россия это воля, which means Russia, it is freedom. It doesn't have the same ring to it as in the Ukrainian way. In summary, the Ukrainian statement is more poetic, it's more liberating, and it's more existential, whereas the Russian Россия это воля would be more stoic, it would be more strong and philosophical as compared to the Ukrainian way of saying it. This symbol fundamentally shows that Ukraine's identity is not built on dominance, it's built on resilience and on choice, on suffering consciously and surviving it. So where Russia turns outwards, projecting on the West, right, using the Z symbol to use the other, the enemy, to define itself because it's lacking identity or having an identity crisis at the moment, Ukraine, on the other side, is turning inward, right, into the unconscious. It's reclaiming its past, right, and confronting its pain. Through that, it's the country itself, the collective of Ukraine, the collective unconscious, the society as well, is forging its own future, right? So it ties modern Ukraine to the Kievan Rus, asserting that Ukraine, not Russia, is the true heir to that ancient state, in a way. So when Ukraine raises the Tryzub today, it is reclaiming a symbol older than Moscow. It's invoking a dynasty and a culture that predates the Russian imperial claims. It's expressing a deep indigenous identity rather than a reactionary one, as we can see with the Russian symbol. You have to remember that these symbols are fundamentally picked unconsciously, right? And it reflects the collective unconscious of that given nation. So in the Ukrainian point of view, the Tryzub can be viewed as a symbol of continuity, right? Of something that was, is, and continues to be. It's a legitimate heritage, but with the Russians, it's a projection. So the Ukrainians are integrating and the Russians are projecting in this sense. You can see that this symbolism really matters in conflicts because it shows the true intent of the unconscious of that given nation. You can, in my previous video, where I'm essentially ranting about Russia's identity crisis and younger brother complex, I also explain how the Nazi symbolism was also unconscious, right? Carl Jung himself analyzed these Nazi symbols that the Germans used and explained their meaning. This ties itself into also what's happening and taking place today. Ultimately, you can find parallels between the Russian current identity crisis and between the Nazi German identity crisis. Both nations were going through a younger brother complex, right? And that's what caused them to lash out. But the main takeaway that I'd like to leave here is that this entire conflict ought not to be blamed on a specific nation because, or an individual, because Putin, where the Westerners project onto Putin, often they say that Putin is the embodiment of evil. He's not the reason, he's a symptom of a fundamentally bigger problem, all right, psychological problem. The same problem that caused World War II, right? And it's repeating itself. So this shows you that this is not just a national issue, it's a fundamentally human issue. And unless the individual is going to individuate, then this cycle of constant wars, dictatorships, and suffering is not going to end. So that's my point that I'd like to make.